Perfect. Again, well, it's great to be back. I was here not that long ago doing a webinar, so it's great to be back again. Thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Becky Matthew, and I am a community behavior consultant that works at the Break Shop Clinic at CPRI. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, the name Break Shop Clinic will make sense, because typically people think mechanics when they hear brake shops, and they look at me and they say, you don't seem like a mechanic, and you would be absolutely correct. You do not want me working on your car, or you'd never be able to drive it again. But when we talk about CPRI, our mission is to enhance the quality of life in children with complex mental health, and also developmental challenges. So there's several different inpatient and outpatient clinics at CPRI. As I mentioned, I work in the Break Shop Clinic, and we provide highly specialized evidence-based services, including assessment, consultation, treatment, research, and education. This is part one of a three-part webinar. So as we progress through some of these topics, in the final one, I'll be speaking a little bit more specifically about some of those specialized treatment services and how somebody may access those. There's a lot of information that I will be trying to cram in today. As always, I always have way more information than time. So I've included a lot of the information in the slides, which you will have a link to, so you can have a copy of that. And again, if we don't get through all of the material today, some of it I will defer to our next webinar in a few weeks. But let's get started. Again, the topic is leaky brakes, what they are and what they aren't. So when we think about terms of behavior, and maybe we know a youth, work with a youth, love a youth, have a youth, that we're really just kind of stuck on where to go next, what to do, how to help, how to manage some of these behaviors. And it feels like I've tried everything except the kitchen sink. And so really it's about stopping to think about, okay, what could be going on here? If none of these strategies or things are working, then maybe there's something else. Maybe it's the youth has a problem versus the youth is a problem, which sometimes can be a difficult shift depending on some of the different behaviors that we are seeing on a more regular basis. So before I talk about the different leaky brake disorders or disorders of disinhibition, I want to first talk about what is inhibition. So if we think about inhibition, inhibition is the ability really to stop, to be able to put on the brakes, to have that cognitive control, regulation, restraint. Basically, it's being able to suppress some of our behaviors or impulses. We're able to kind of take stock of what's going on and think about how our response may impact those around us. Inhibition failures or faulty neurocircuitry, when things aren't quite working, may be called different things by different people. Psychologists may call it inhibition failures. Neurologists call it faulty neurocircuitry. When working in the Break Shop Clinic, we figured those names would be too much of a mouthful to call our clinic, but we describe those as leaky brakes, as I'll get into a little bit more detail in the coming slides. So why is inhibition important? If we think about inhibition, it's almost like it provides this inner workbench. So this cognitive workbench where I can take in the information around me, information coming at me, words being spoken, things that are happening in the room, and I can put it up on my workbench to determine which is the best way to respond. It's almost like it inserts a pause from thought to response. Very often when we're working with youth, it's like there is no filter is often what we hear from people. What comes in here is automatically out. And that might just be an indication that they are struggling with that inhibition. Without inhibition, things and responses can look much different. You may have that ready, fire, aim, doing things kind of backwards, or that leap before you look. We all have urges and impulses However, if our inhibition or our mental workbench is working, our brains are working so well that we don't even realize that we're putting the brakes on all the time and that these are often firing in nanoseconds. If my inner workbench is working, then I might be able to take stock of who's in the room. Who am I talking to? Can this response get me in trouble? Are there going to be consequences? Are there going to be rewards? And that inner workbench or that inhibition kind of inserts again that filter. For example, let's just say I'm working and my boss comes up at the very end of the day and says, hey, Becky, we have these last minute things that need to get done. How do you feel about staying for an extra couple hours to get that done? My thought might be like, are you kidding me? Again, overtime? I'm not staying. No way. You always do this last minute. It's not fair. If I have that mental workbench or that inhibition, I'm going to pause and think about how might that response come across to my boss, and I might clean it up for consumption. I might then actually say something like, you know what? I would be happy to stay and do that overtime again. Or I can stay for part of it, but just not all of it. And I can change the response from what initially popped in my head. Inhibition also develops over time. When we think about inhibition now more than ever in 2024, we value a good braking system. They can take time to develop. Inhibition skills come with maturity, come with age, and it continues to age and mature as we progress through that. We do our best to comply to social norms. There are these social norms that say what's acceptable, what's not, depending on the setting that we're in, whether it's school, home, work. All the different environments have this kind of idea of what inhibition should look like. And we often do our best to try to comply with these social norms because we don't necessarily want the consequences that might come from not following that. Things like rejection or loss of privileges that can happen. The problem is there's this ongoing struggle of inhibition. And the CBC radio once described the brain and inhibition as the reptilian weenie wrapped in a cortical bun. So basically what that is, it's the brain's imperfect design. So the Nike area of the brain, so this kind of part that says, just do it, go for it. That sounds amazing. Just do it, blow off work, go to the beach, have fun, do all these things, is again firing nanoseconds all the time. But the cortical bun, or that frontal lobe, comes down, we call it kind of like the wet blanket that says, wait a minute, remember what happened the last time you did that? Or do you really think that that's going to be in your better interest to blow that off or do this thing? And it helps us, again, insert that pause, put it up on our mental workbench. But it's not always working together the way that it should. So when it's not firing appropriately, you'll see an increase in movements, which is leaky breaks over attention or impulses, or what we call those ADHD type things. And there can be lots of other things that are impacted because of this imperfect design. When we talk about leaky breaks, and I'm going to break down each and every one of these as we go throughout the evening, but we can have leaky break over our movements. And so youth that have Tourette Syndrome or tic disorder don't have that braking system when it comes to stopping all movements and sounds. Or those that struggle with sensory input may have a leaky break over their senses. Those that have a diagnosis of ADHD or ADD have that leaky break over attention or impulses. Sounds, again, can be that sensory input. Those that have anxiety or OCD would have that leaky break over thoughts. And those that are really struggling with that self-regulation or, again, that impulses may have some of that leaky break over behavior or, again, that ADHD impulses. So what if you lost that cortex or the ability to put on the brakes when you need them? Or if they work imperfectly, Sometimes they seem to be working, but only in certain situations or certain times, but they're not always there when you need them. They're what we call leaky or very inconsistent. If we were to look at that difference between maturational delays versus disability, maturational delay might just be for some kids, it takes a little bit longer to mature. It takes them a little bit longer to catch up, but they eventually do. For example, if you were to take a look at a kindergarten classroom, you might have all types of ability in that class. You might have some kids that can tie their shoes and some that are still struggling to do that. You might have some that can count to 100 and some that can maybe make it to 10. And so you start to see some of those differences in ability. But typically by the time they get up to grade 3 or the older ages, those that were maybe a little bit more delayed have caught up. Maturational disabilities are essentially when they hit that brick wall. So they've reached their limits of ability. And with those types of things, you can't fix those. There are things that you can do to help some of those things, but it's not something that you will just grow out of. By age about 15 or 16, it can become a little bit more obvious if we're dealing with disability versus a delay. And you might pause and ask yourself, is this behavior appropriate for the age? If you see a baby that is throwing a tantrum because they have to wait on their food or, their needs being met, it's very age appropriate. But if I'm doing that in the Tim Hortons line where I have to wait a few minutes for my coffee and I've thrown myself on the floor and having an epic tantrum, it's not so age appropriate anymore. We would definitely be taking a look at what's actually going on there. If you are ever wondering about, is this a delay versus a disability, you would want to take the youth to a professional to have that assessed. So whether it's a psychiatrist, a developmental pediatrician, psychologist, they would be able to complete the assessments to determine that more accurately. And again, as they get older, it becomes more obvious as the gap begins to widen. It's really important to take a look at these leaky break disorders as a developmental disability. It's not immaturity. It's not them just trying to seek attention in a negative way, although that may be what's happening. It's not a lack of motivation, and it's certainly not a lack of intelligence. When we start to change our lens on and how we look at the behaviors, looking at it specifically as that developmental disability, it really helps guide not only our understanding of what could be going on, but also our interventions. So we're not throwing everything but the kitchen sink at it anymore. We have a better understanding of what could be happening. The first leaky break that I want to take a look at is ADHD or ADD. So there are 3 subtypes to ADHD. There's the hyperactive impulsive, inattentive, or you can have the combined type for both. I'm going to start off showing a video as they do a really great job describing how it's assessed, what it can feel like, because I think with ADHD is sometimes this can be one that is quite misunderstood or misinterpreted. Often we hear, oh, you have ADHD, you can't pay attention. And actually it's the opposite. They're gifted in attention. Their difficulty is modulating their attention or focusing their attention on what needs to be focused on for the amount of time required. And there's so many different parts to executive function that can be impacted by ADHD. Things like procrastination, emotion regulation, clutter, getting started. There's so many different parts to understanding that. Metacognition, being able to take a look, a bird's eye view of how we're responding to different things. So it's so much more than just the attention. That's certainly a big part of it, and being able to inhibit our impulses in times where that is required. But again, I'm just going to go ahead and show the video because they do such a great job describing it.
I think when somebody walks into the office, they don't know what to expect. And the single biggest complaint for many of the patients that I see is that someone has had them fill out a checklist. The checklist showed that they had these symptoms or those symptoms, and therefore they received a diagnosis of ADHD. A good assessment for ADHD includes finding out why the patient's there, the history of how they came to be there, the family psychiatric history, the medical history, most important, the developmental history, because ADHD, when it's present, puts a stamp on each stage of development. So you may see colic in infancy. You may see a preschooler who was expelled from preschool, or you may see a child who couldn't do homework in grade 3 or was kicked off the football team for misbehavior.
You must include a sense of a narrative over time that makes sense to you.
The bottom line really is the person that goes through this process with you is your doctor. Your doctor needs to be able to understand those clinical symptoms, find the settings where it's impairing, get information that tells this individual, tells the physician that there's something wrong. I might be looking at your parents to get information from. I may be looking at the school. I may be looking at circumstances in your life, so you tell me what's going on with you. But the most important thing really is that it takes time to gather all this information. And it's not easy. People have to be trained, and it's better if, in fact, the families are part of the partnership. Did anybody ever make a comment about how you handled the birth of your siblings?
The questions he asked were so pointed that it brought out specifics in my past. So it was enlightening to me to see the patterns being presented to me.
So the process of assessment pulls all that information together.
Mm-hmm. And typically, I need to talk to somebody from your past. Now, the ideal person is your mom. Now, all moms by now whitewash everything from childhood. It's kind of like, he was a good boy. What's the problem? Everything was fine. But just like I went through with you, part of the intent really is to get those stories from childhood. If those stories match your stories, well, that's significant. And there may be other stories back there that might be even more relevant. If I didn't have your mom or was not accessible, then I'd be asking from your spouse, who usually talks to moms, or anyone else that I necessarily could get a story of your child, maybe your elder brother, for example. That might be a story. So, getting information from somebody else, learning more about you, and those questionnaires become the 3 parts to this diagnosis.
I view people who are non-ADD as, I envy them to a degree. I envy the fact that there's a calm in their life that I don't know. Now you may be thinking, I lose my keys, I must be ADD. Hey, wait, not necessarily. As we travel around North America interviewing all these experts, every one of our crew members ultimately thought, hey, I think I'm ADD.
A lot of people who don't have ADHD look like they have ADHD because they want to do so much in so many shorter period of time.
It's no wonder the skeptics dismiss it, huh? I mean, that's why self-diagnosis is so dangerous. Because being ADD is not about being occasionally overwhelmed or occasionally confused. This is ongoing.
It shouldn't be attention deficit. It's an attention modulation deficit. So someone who has ADHD can focus, but not always at the right time or for enough time or on the right task.
And as authors Kate Kelly and Peggy Raimondo point out, there's 4 aspects to focusing. And the first being, what the heck to focus on? I go to answer an email, and then I realize, well, I better just enter these receipts before I forget. So I'll enter the receipts and do that. And then it's like, you know what? I just need to anti-stress here for a minute. I'm just going to play a quick game of solitaire, and I'll do that. And then, okay, 1 round of that. And then it's like, oh my goodness, the guitar's sitting there. I just want to play a song before this thing happens because I want to remember those chords. I got a show in a month. I might want to remember that. Put that aside for a while. Then it's like, oh, photos are sliding off my day. And then I'll come out to Janice and I'll go, I didn't even answer the email. The second aspect of focusing is focus itself, staying on task.
Okay, so this is the screening replacement kit, right? Replace the screen. So
We have to replace our screens all the time because the dog keeps running through.
You get a spline, which is
I put one of those little doors on, but the dog doesn't seem to recognize the door. It goes right through the screen.
And then there's
Habits. Habits are often raised.
utility knife. Do you
I have a utility knife.
Okay,
yeah.
so
it's more of a blade than a knife. I don't know why they call it a knife. There's nothing sharp about it other than the blade. It
Step
should
one
be
is
a
to lay the
utility
screen
blade,
frame
really.
flat on so you will lay this on the flat surface. Then you're going to use a screwdriver to pry up the spline.
See,
You
this
discard the old
screwdriver. I'm talking
screen and the
Phillips or standard. We
spline.
don't even know.
Which is included in the kit.
See, a lot of people think this is what
Spline,
ADD is.
installation
Actually,
tool,
it's just a part of it staying on
utility
task.
knife.
And the third element of focusing is monitoring focusing. So you're not focusing on any one object too long, or what they call hyper-focusing, because that's detrimental when you...
I took my licensing exam for psychology. I think we had 4.5 hours to take it. I took one break. My friend took it. She took 4 or 5 breaks.
So if you watch a television set, which is very stimulating, and my brain gets all the stimulation it needs, my filter does this, and I can focus.
If I really care about something, I can focus on it in ways that nobody I know can.
And it's just not under their voluntary control.
Pat, everybody's waiting. They're starting to close the store. Pat, this is the fourth aspect that people with ADD have trouble with, and that's the aspect of shifting focus. For ADD people, it can be really painful to go from one thing to
and not being able to
another. Not always,
very easily.
You don't want to get off whatever it is you're doing. You feel that, God, it's so much effort to get here. Please don't make me do that again.
What's it like being ADD?
There's a feeling when you have unmedicated ADD that I don't feel good. I don't feel enough. There's something out there.
When you're raising children, when you're thinking of, I'll do that tomorrow, next week, I'll make sure that I spend more time with him and do things like that. But you pass over that moment because you're thinking beyond that moment of work now and getting what next. And so you miss a lot of opportunities in life.
You're stuck on channel surfing mode, and you don't have the remote control.
Someone else was zapping the channels.
The person who mentored me in coaching she says, just once I'd like to drive my brain instead of the other way around.
The cartoon, The Roadrunner, you know, he's just zipping along all the time, and then he stops, but not for very long, and then he's zipping, zipping, zipping. So I feel like that's the ADD brain. So it's always on to the next thing.
You can't distinguish, foreground and background in terms of sound. So a crowded restaurant could be drive you crazy. It's like fingernails on a blackboard.
Why do ADDers like chaos?
It wakes up your brain. If I just juice things up here and create a little drama, I feel wide awake.
Okay, so again, that's a clip from the movie ADD and Loving It, and I believe you can access that on YouTube still if anybody was interested in watching the full video. But again, I really liked a lot of that information that it was sharing and talking about some of the different things and why it can be misunderstood. We talked about, I forgot my keys or I lost my keys, I must have ADD. But when we're looking at this leaky break over attention or impulses or diagnosis of ADHD, there's very specific criteria that needs to be met in order for it to be ADHD, because distractibility can be a symptom of several different things. So if they're truly looking at that diagnosis of ADHD, they're going to be looking at this specific criteria, that it has persisted for at least 6 months, that it's inconsistent with the developmental level, that these symptoms were present before age 12. And what is really important is that these are impairing in several different settings. So they'll be looking at home and school in some of the different settings, and that it's not better accounted for by another disorder. And I think that is a really important piece as well, where they'd be looking at things like sensory struggles or anxiety or some of the other things that could also look like inattention. So if we look at that first one, that part about the impulses, so in that ADHD, this again is what we call that leaky break over our impulses. And so this might be the youth that is really doing things in the wrong order, that leap before you look. Or, they're the ones in school that have their hand up to answer the question, but they're yelling out the answer before they're being called on. So you might see youth that have a really hard time waiting their turn, or often interrupting or intruding on others' conversation. They might actually be having a conversation over here and then interjecting and answering questions from a conversation that they're hearing going on in another part of the room. Or these would be the kids that are often squirming or fidgeting in their chairs, or actually even having a really hard time staying seated in places where this would be required: school, meals, movies, those kinds of things. They may be often, out running, climbing excessively, often on the go, appearing very driven by a motor. Youth with the hyperactivity or the impulsive type, again, are that leap before you look. And so this can often get them in a lot of trouble. There may be a lot of talking, excessively, and again, having that difficulty being able to really focus on what it is that they're supposed to be doing, and to rein in that need for movement and as well. The other part is that leaky break over our attention. And so again, there needs to be very specific criteria that is met through the DSM-5. So if you have the doctors doing the assessment, they will be looking at those very specific criteria. But these youth that have the leaky break over attention, often they may have been described as, not trying hard enough, lazy, not applying themselves, as they may be failing to give close attention to detail, often don't appear to be listening when being spoken to directly, not able to follow through on instructions. These might be the youth where, they get home, you say, okay, I want you to take off your shoes, hang up your backpack, head upstairs, change your clothes, and come on back downstairs and we can have a snack. And they're not able to retain those multiple step instructions. So they get up to the room, kind of forget what they're supposed to be doing. Now they're engaged in reorganizing their closet or playing, and they've completely forgotten what is supposed to be done at that time. They may have a lot of difficulty organizing tasks or activities, or making sure they have the material required for those tasks and activities. They may actually have a really hard time or avoid or dislike engaging in tasks that will require sustained mental effort. So they may look like they're avoiding a lot of different things, but it's because they know it's going to be very difficult for them to sustain their attention for the amount of time required. So it's just easier to not get started. They're often very forgetful, often easily distracted by external stimulus. This might be the youth that is about to write a test, and let's just say they're in school and they're going to write a test. They're very motivated to do well because they've been told that they'll get a reward if they do well. They've been studying, you've been quizzing them, they know the answers in the quiz, and they sit down to write this test. The teacher says, get started, and they're getting ready, they write their name at the top, and then they notice a custodian who's cutting the grass outside. No, I hope he's okay. No, okay, back to the test. Why is that light flickering? I thought they were supposed to do something, but I was so, right, no, okay, back to the test, back to the test. Oh, little Susie dropped her pencil. I should probably go help her with it. Nope, back to the test. Okay. Oh, what am I having for lunch today? I hope it's pizza. I hope it's not tuna again. I hate tuna. Oh, right, no, okay, back to the test. And then the teacher says, time's up. By the end of that, they look like they're unprepared, didn't study, weren't trying to do hard, unmotivated, when really what was going on was that leaky break over attention was getting in the way, because it was none of those things. They were very motivated, they were very prepared, they were just not able to focus their attention when needed. Okay. So when we think about how can this look behaviorally, it can look very purposeful, very button pushing. It's really kind of like an amplification of maybe some of the thoughts. When we think about, again, that mental workbench, when I can put a thought up on my mental workbench, clean it up for consumption, insert that pause. Often youth with the leaky break over attention and impulses have a very, very difficult time being able to do that. You might actually have, let's just say you're looking at a classroom that has a substitute teacher. The substitute teacher comes in and says, hey, we're actually not going to be doing phys ed today. We're going to be doing crafts, and we're going to be, making these glitter snowmen. You might have Sally, who has a working braking system, who's thinking, what? Why are we doing that? We're supposed to be doing phys ed. I was looking forward to phys ed. This sounds so stupid. I don't want to be playing with like glitter and snowmen. I want to be out, doing sports and playing in the gym. But she's put that thought on her mental workbench, realized that response will probably get her in trouble, puts her hand up and is able to say, Miss, I'm happy to help you set up all the supplies that's required for the craft. she was able to clean that up for consumption. Little Johnny, who might be having the exact same thought, what comes out of his mouth? What? This is stupid. We're supposed to be doing gym. Why are we doing this? Gets in trouble, sent out of the class, down to the principal's office. 2 kids, the exact same thought. One had the working mental workbench. The other one had leaky breaks. Okay. So when we start to take a look at the impacts on youth, here's some of them: the poor working memory, poor time management and sequencing, being able to remember steps to tasks. They might actually have a more difficult time falling asleep or staying asleep. These might be the youth that are really stalling at bedtime. Now they remember everything they wanted to tell you throughout the day, or they want to get, a glass of water, and it just, the bedtime routine goes on and on. And they may fall asleep faster during daytime hours, so you might find them napping more frequently. So all of those things can be very difficult for the youth. Lots of difficulty with social skills if you think about that impulsivity. So things that we maybe shouldn't do, kind of the thumbs down, is misinterpreting some of the behavior. So the fidgeting, the lack of eye contact, maybe that poor mark on the test wasn't because they weren't prepared. So trying not to misinterpret what we're seeing. Mistake execution for knowledge. Just because they can't get the information out doesn't mean that they don't know it. They're just maybe not able to do it in that moment. A difficult one, not being insulted or personalized by some of their bluntness in their comments, or withholding activity, especially physical activity. This is often what we're saying, is that we shoot both of ourselves in the foot if we don't allow them to still get out and do some of that physical activity that their bodies require. But what we can do is provide visual instructions, checklists. A lot of those things can be really helpful so that they know exactly what's next on their to-do list, and they don't have to try to remember or put that strain on their working memory right in front of them. Because often what happens is the more they repeat something, the more it becomes rote, and there's no longer a demand on their working memory. It's just something they've done over and over again, and now they can execute it easily, versus something new where they really have to think about what those next steps are. Chunking is a huge part for those that are struggling with the ADHD. Taking a large task and chunking it down into manageable steps can be really helpful. A lot of the procrastination and stuff is because of that overwhelm of not knowing where to get started. Do they have the right supplies? What do I do? How much time is this going to take? Because there's often a time blindness that comes with the ADHD as well. And then celebrating the effort that we're seeing, not necessarily the execution of being able to do something exactly correctly, but the effort that we're seeing them put into it. Okay, so that was the first leaky break over attention and impulses, or the diagnosis of ADHD. The next diagnosis that I want to take a look at is Tourette Syndrome or tic disorders, which is a leaky break over movements and sounds. Again, I have another video of different youth that are describing some of the different types of tics and what this looks like. So I'm going to let them start off doing the explaining, and then I'm going to come back and chat about it a little bit more.
What are tics? Would you know a tic if you saw one? Hi, I'm Pearson. I'm 10 years old, and I have Tourette Syndrome.
Hi, my name is Caleb. My name is Brianna. My name's Emily. And I have Tourette's. But Tourette's doesn't have me. I have Tourette's, but Tourette's doesn't have me. And I have Tourette's, but Tourette's doesn't have me.
Tourette's is one kind of tic disorder.
Tics are involuntary movements and sounds that I can't control.
Sometimes you might not see my tics, but I still have Tourette Syndrome.
Only 5 to 10% of people with Tourette's have swearing tics.
What I wish people knew about Tourette's is that we can't control it. It's not contagious, it's not life-threatening, and there is no cure. Motor tics are involuntary movements. Some examples of motor tics are
forceful blinking,
facial twitching,
facial grimacing,
mouth opening, head shaking,
head jerking,
shoulder shrugging, arm movements, hitting, leg lifting, body shrinking,
Vocal tics are involuntary sounds. Some examples of vocal tics are
throat clearing, sniffing, animal noises, blowing.
saying words or phrases,
apple, 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 pomegranate.
screaming,
Having Tourette's makes me feel good and bad. Bad because sometimes it hurts, and sometimes people think I'm just misbehaving. Good because it's just how I'm made and who I am.
I have Tourette's, but Tourette's doesn't have me. I have Tourette's, but Tourette's doesn't have me.
I got Tourette's, but Tourette's doesn't have me.
I have Tourette's, but Tourette's doesn't have me.
Okay, so we look at some of the information they were sharing. I think they do such a great job demonstrating some of the different tics that they have. Tics typically wax and they wane. So you might have some tics that are very present for some time, and then you might see that they kind of just go away for really no explanation, or there can be a new one that comes in its place. In order to have the diagnosis, the tics need to be present for more than 1 year with a break no greater than 3 months and with an onset before the age of 18. If they have 2 motor tics and 1 vocal tic, then that would be a diagnosis of Tourette syndrome. If they have just one or the other, for example, just strictly motor tics, then they may have a motor tic disorder. And also with the vocal tics, if they have just the vocal tics, then they would likely have a vocal tic disorder. Now, regardless whether it's Tourette syndrome or a tic disorder, the treatment for tics is the same. And I'm going to be talking about that in more detail in the third webinar series. We'll be talking about the gold standard treatment for Tourette syndrome and tic disorders, which is comprehensive behavioral intervention for tics, or CBIT for short. There can often be a lot of misperceptions about Tourette syndrome. The media really killed us for a while. When people hear Tourette syndrome, oh, it means you swear a lot. But as I mentioned in that video, that's in less than 10% of all people with Tourette syndrome or vocal tic have that swearing tic or the inappropriate word tic. You can have motor or vocal tics as they described and demonstrated in the video, and they can be simple or complex. So a simple vocal tic might just be a simple sound, a sniff, a ha, ha, just a simple one syllable type sound. A simple motor tic would involve just one muscle group. So maybe it's an eye blink or a shoulder shrug or just one part of the body that's moving. Complex tics, complex vocal tics could either be full words or sentences, and complex motor tics would involve more than one muscle group. So you might have a whole arm thrust and then possibly a head jerk or anything that's going to involve some of those more muscles kind of moving together. Coprolalia, again, is the swearing tic or inappropriate words, which again occurs in less than 10% of all people with Tourette syndrome. There may be what we call echolalia tics, so they may repeat the last word that they hear. So, maybe they're in the school setting and the teacher says, okay, it's time to get started, pull out your books. You may hear books, 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 books. So again, without knowing that child has Tourette syndrome or tic disorder, can look very behavioral and can sometimes get them in trouble. One tic that we find sometimes does land youth in trouble is the eye rolling tic. A very simple tic, but certainly if somebody is not aware that person has tics, when you give them information and they roll their eyes, then it can be misinterpreted very differently without that knowledge. When it comes to the tics, the tic that you're seeing or you're hearing is actually the second part of the tic. The tic is only occurring because of the first part, which is the premonitory urge. So it's a sensation or a feeling that they get in their body prior to the tic coming out. So if I were to liken that to a mosquito bite, the premonitory urge is like the itch of a mosquito bite, and the tic is the scratching of that itch. So the urge is present. The tic occurs in order to, and as an attempt to kind of scratch that itch to make that urge go away. And it may work momentarily, but then we often have to continue to keep that going. Tics love attention, even positive attention. So maybe there's a youth that has a throat clearing tic, and we might say, oh, wow, that sounds really painful. Can I get you a glass of water as they're ticking? Well, that sounds like a very kind thing to do. However, because we did it at the time that the tic was occurring, drawing attention to the tic, we've actually inadvertently reinforced that tic. Now, that doesn't mean we would never give the child a glass of water. It just would be not in response to the tic. So they would always have access to water and know that they can go get themselves a drink whenever they need to. Or maybe they have pain in their shoulders from some of the motor tics that they may have. And so each day you have it set up that you give them a quick shoulder massage at bedtime, whether or not they're ticking. So it's not in response to that tic. Another thing that a lot of youth will endorse, especially in public settings like school or other places that they may go, is suppression. So suppression is them working really hard to hold in their tics. It's not uncommon for us to be meeting with schools and to hear we didn't even know they had tics. We've never seen a tic or heard a tic in the classroom. And that could be because they're working really hard to suppress those tics. Suppression in itself isn't good or bad, but what we want to take a look at is what's the cost, because it can take a lot of physical, emotional, and mental energy in order to suppress those tics. We often talk about suppression as kind of like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. Can probably do that pretty easily for a few minutes, but I actually have to engage my muscles and hold that beach ball underwater because beach balls are designed to float. So if I let go, it's going to come up. And that's kind of like what trying to hold tics in, or it's been described as like being covered in bug bites and not being able to scratch. But if we imagine holding that beach ball underwater, can do it pretty easily for a short period of time. But what if we're still holding that beach ball underwater an hour later, 6 hours later? eventually you're going to have to let go. And that's very similar to what can happen with holding the tics in. Some kids will say, I can give you one period of suppression and then I'm done. Or some might say, I hold my tics in all day, but as soon as they get home, all it takes is, the caregiver saying, hey, how was your day? And boom, met with an explosion, either of behavior or tics, or some of those things returning to baseline. Holding in tics can certainly increase irritability, defiance, obsessiveness, explosiveness, because again, the sheer amount of energy on many different levels that it takes in order to engage in that suppression. And some of those complex tics, again, if we're not aware of the youth having tics, then it can look very behavioral. Tics are highly suggestible, so the more attention you give them, the more we're going to see those tics come out. We often see what we call this parakinesia. So some youth that are quite embarrassed by their tics, especially if they have loud vocal tics, might actually be doing things to mask their tics because they'd rather look like the bad kid than, as they describe, the weird kid or the kid that makes sounds. Dr. McKinley, who is the creator of the Break Shot Clinic and has Tourette Syndrome himself, would talk about when he could feel that some of his very loud vocal tics were coming and there wasn't going to be any way he could suppress those and hold those in. He would gather all of his textbooks onto his desk, and right when that tic came out, he would drop all the textbooks onto the floor and make a big loud noise because he would rather get in trouble for that than for the sound of the tics and other people to realize that he had these tics. So that can sometimes look very behavioral. However, it is maybe something that they're doing to try to hide their embarrassment from some of the tics. A large part of our job becomes making their different environments tick-friendly zones. Once people know that these are tics, it often becomes easier for the youth to just feel like they need to that they can let these tics out. And then when the stress of that decreases, we often see the tics will decrease as well, because stress can certainly exacerbate tics and make them come out even more. Doesn't cause tics, but can certainly impact the tics and make them worse. And often, when we think about, if we were to think about the coprolalia tic, the swearing tic, or the inappropriate word tic, often youth are working really hard to not say that. And so the more they're thinking, don't say it, don't say it, don't say it, the more we might start to see that come out of me. Kind of like if I'm saying right now, okay, everybody here, I don't want anybody thinking about a pink elephant. Whatever you do, don't think of a pink elephant. Think about anything other than a pink elephant, but don't think about a pink elephant. Chances are we're all in some way thinking about a pink elephant right now. And so that can be some of the things that kids are working really hard against as well. I remember working with one youth that had the F-bomb tic. So he had the coprolalia tic. And this was not a youth that cursed, and it was actually quite mortified by this tic. But it only came out in one area. If anybody can guess where that tic came out, church, right? The one place that you would not want to be saying that or yelling that out. So his brain was working overtime, don't tic, don't tic. And his brain was hearing tic, tic. And so he did a lot of work to be able to change that tic. So again, through the treatment, they can learn how to eliminate some of their bothersome tics. And we say to them too, having tics is not bad. It's only a problem if it's a problem for you. So if you have tics that you like, keep them. We're not going to do anything to change that. But if you have tics that are bothering you and getting in the way, that's where we want to be able to help. So possible struggles for youth with tics, they might have some motor skills difficulties. So again, if they're constantly moving because of some of their tics, it can make that coordination really difficult. We had one youth that really struggled when we were playing hockey because every time he went to take a shot, his tics came out. And so he was really frustrated by some of those motor skill impacts that he had. There can be some struggles with learning because if you're working really hard on suppressing all day long, it makes it really hard to pay attention to the lessons that are happening in class. There can be sleep disturbance that happens. Sensitivity to touch and heat. Often people with Tourette syndrome, their internal temperature is a little bit warmer than ours on average. And so putting them in a place, summer can be really tough for some of our youth with Tourette syndrome. And I remember when we worked with Dr. McKinley, his office was, we joked, it was the meat locker. It was always set really, really cold because of that sensitivity to heat. And again, tics can create difficulty with peers, physically, so there can be a lot of impacts, especially if they haven't told people that they have tics or Tourette syndrome. So what we don't want to do is pretend it's not there, which might be confusing because you just said, Becky, don't give it attention. So you want me to give it attention? No, we want you to let the youth talk about it as they're comfortable, and maybe educate outside of the tic and let the class know, or let the family members know that they have tics or Tourette syndrome. It wasn't uncommon for when youth would come into our clinic when they would first join, because again, the break shop is the Tourette clinic and the associated disorders. And families would pull me aside before I met with the youth to explain all of this using our Leaky break language. And they would say, they don't know that they have tics or Tourette syndrome. And often I say, yes, they do. They just don't know what it's called. Let's give it a name. Let's normalize it. Let's name that elephant in the room. And that would often settle things so that the youth knows, oh, there's a name for this. This isn't something that's wrong with me. This is just the way that my brain is working. We don't want to react to tics, give it the attention, and don't remind them of a tic when it disappears. Hey, I noticed that your sniffing tic is gone. It's been a long time since you've done that sniffing. And we might see that tic come out because, again, of the suggestibility. What we do want to encourage is tic breaks, allowing them to remove themselves if they need to go let some of the tics out in private. Some are okay to do it in front of people. Some would prefer privacy, or maybe taking a look at preferential seating. Maybe they're sitting towards the back of the room if they have some big motor tics that they don't want to feel like they're on display at the front of the room, or close to the door where they can slip out and have some of those tic breaks. And then proactively consider their stress levels, knowing that stress increases tics as well. And again, in the third webinar, I'll be talking more specifically about the treatment of tics as well. Okay, next leaky break is leaky break over thoughts, or what we call the obsessive compulsive disorder. So again, Peter just did a little thing there. So again, there's very specific criteria that needs to be met in order to receive a diagnosis of OCD. Because some people think, oh man, I like things really neat. I'm always straightening things up. I must have OCD, or you know, I don't like to touch other people. I must have OCD. And maybe you have some OCD tendencies, but there's, again, very specific criteria that needs to be met in order to have the diagnoses. So presence of both obsessions and compulsions, very time-consuming, greater than an hour a day, significant impairment, not attributable to other mental disorders. So again, very specific criteria. When we talk about OCD, a lot of people often think about the contamination flavor of OCD. You know, those that maybe don't like to be touched or touch things, or, you know, we think of Howie Mandel, who kind of invented the fist pump, who made it very public about his OCD and brought a lot of education and light to that, which was great. And so that's the one that is more obvious that we tend to see. But that's actually only one flavor of OCD, because there's 4 different flavors to OCD. So you might have the contamination flavor, where maybe you're worried about being contaminated, contaminating others, getting sick, germs, sticky things, radiation. But there's also what we call a just right flavor. So that's where things have to be done in a certain way. Just right has to look just right, feel just right, be just right. So that might be things have to be lined up in a certain way. You have to sit in your chair all the time. Things may need to be color coded. There may be rules that they have to follow, very specific rules. And that all falls under that just right flavor. There may be what we call bad thoughts flavor. And these often can be very violent pictures or thoughts that get stuck in their head, very intrusive, very distressing for the person that has them. And they're often violent, religious, or sexual in nature. So they may be very hesitant to talk about them, or maybe they have shared a little bit about them, and then maybe they got in trouble for some of these things. But they're very distressed by these thoughts because they think that they're their thoughts and that they must want to do this if they're thinking about some of these things. So there's the bad thoughts, the just right, the contamination, and the last flavor is hoarding. So they may be collecting things. Maybe they've started collecting things like stuffies, but now they've got 874 stuffies and they can't leave the house without them, or there's no room for them to sleep on their bed because there's so many of them. or they may even collect items like rocks, sticks, gum wrappers, shoe boxes, clothes from their childhood that they're not able to get rid of. So even things that don't appear to have a lot of value would cause a lot of distress in attempting to give them away or get rid of them. Again, in the third webinar, I'll be talking about the gold standard treatment for OCD, which is exposure and response prevention. But before I chat a little bit more about OCD, I'm just going to do another quick video here.
Our whole universe was in a hot, dense state that nearly 14 billion years ago expansion started. Wait, the earth began to cool, the autotrophs began to drool, Neanderthals developed tools, we built a wall. We built the pyramids, math, science, history, unraveling the mystery that all started with a big bang.
Gentlemen, I put it to you. The worst tapioca pudding is better than the best pudding of any other flavor.
First off, that is axiomatically wrong because the best pudding is chocolate. Secondly, the organic structure of tapioca makes it a jiggling bowl of potential death. It is extracted from the plant.
Hey, I'm thinking of growing a mustache. No kidding. Fu Manchu, a handlebar pencil?
It's extracted from the plant.
Yeah, you know, George Clooney has one now. Really? I once saw him shopping at Ralph's. He was buying tequila. Oh, you think a guy like that would have some kind of booze lackey? All right, this is cruel. We better let him finish before his head explodes. All right, Sheldon, why is
Tapioca is extracted from the root of the plant Monahot esculenta due to a high concentration of cyanide. It is poisonous in its raw form and lethal if prepared improperly.
Feel better now?
It is also indigenous to Brazil, as is the cocoa bean from which we get chocolate, the best pudding. You promised you wouldn't do that anymore.
Sheldon! Shh! Penny's sleeping. Are you insane? You can't just break into a woman's apartment in the middle of the night and clean. I had no choice. I couldn't sleep knowing that just outside my bedroom was our living room, and just outside our living room was that hallway, and immediately adjacent to that hallway was this. Do you realize that if Penny wakes up, there is no reasonable explanation as to why we're here? I just gave you a reasonable explanation. Penny. 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 Penny.
What?
Penny.
Do you guys mind if I start?
Penny, that's where I sit.
Sit next to me.
No, I sit there.
What's the difference?
What's the difference?
Here we go.
In the winter, that seat is close enough to the radiator to remain warm, and yet not so close as to cause perspiration. In the summer, it's directly in the path of a cross breeze created by opening windows there and there. It faces the television at an angle that is neither direct, thus discouraging conversation, nor so far wide as to create a parallax distortion. I could go on, but I think I've made my point.
Do you want me to move?
Well,
just sit somewhere else.
Fine.
Sheldon, sit.
I can't believe I trusted him.
Okay, so what we saw there with Sheldon would be a lot of things in that just right flavor. So things like having to do things in threes, as you saw, you know, he was penny, 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 and then when he was interrupted, he had to finish. So he had to do the funny, and then a little bit of that, cleaning her apartment in the middle of the night because his OCD wouldn't allow him to settle, knowing that it was messy across the hall, or having his seat that he had to sit in, or when they were kind of interrupting him in the beginning, he had to finish. So often when we're in that territory where there's rules that must be followed, we could potentially be in that OCD territory. When we think of OCD, there's the obsession and there's the compulsion. So when we think about it, every single one of us get intrusive or negative thoughts that pop into our head. So if I don't have OCD or anxiety, I get the thought that pops into my head, and this is my brain and this is my braking system. Very quickly, my braking system engages and says, you have nothing to be worried about. You're not actually at risk. You can move on. And very quickly, I can move on. If I have OCD, the thought pops into my head. My braking system is stuck. It doesn't engage when I need it to. And my anxiety starts to rise. Because of that anxiety, I engage in a compulsion to bring that down. And like we saw with Sheldon, having to finish his knocking 3 times, or having to organize things, or having to sit in his seat. So there may be many different rituals or rules or things that OCD has us follow. And again, that is just in an attempt to bring the anxiety down. And the difficult thing is it works for a moment. And so that's where OCD reinforces that you have to do everything that I tell you every time I tell you, or that's the only way your anxiety is going to come down. Because what OCD doesn't want them to know is that if you didn't follow OCD's rules, if you didn't do anything, your body is only designed to stay anxious for so long before it would automatically have to calm, even if you didn't give in to what OCD says. If we use that mosquito bite analogy again, you think about the itch. So this time with OCD, it's a cognitive itch. So we get that anxious thought. There's the itch of the mosquito bite. The compulsion is the scratching of the itch. And if we imagine the mosquito bite, we scratch it and we go, for a moment. But then we have to keep scratching, and it gets itchier and itchier. And that's essentially what happens with the OCD. The more we give in and follow OCD's rules, the bigger that OCD gets. And sometimes even the smaller our world can get. The difficult thing is that OCD can appear very irrational, very nonsensical. Maybe I have the just right flavor of OCD, and say at school, my desk, everything is in its place. And if you move my pencil even a centimeter to the left, I'm going to know, and there's going to be hell to pay. Yeah, my bedroom looks like the Tasmanian devil lives in there. And you say, how does that make any sense whatsoever? Why do you have to be so neat here and you can be so messy over there? And that's just because OCD decided desk is their territory and doesn't care about the bedroom. So again, that can make it very difficult, very confusing, and can look very behavioral as well. When we think about OCD, it can sometimes be quite debilitating for those that have OCD. It's like having a mental bully following you around all the time. It can impact social interactions. They might look like the bossy kid on the playground because OCD has them following their rules. So in order for them to feel calm and okay, they have to get you to follow the rules as well. And so that can be very difficult. With the just right and the bad thoughts OCD, it can be more invisible. We're not seeing them washing their hands, or things that might be a little bit more obvious. I think of a youth that we were working with, and they were testing for learning disability because reading comprehension was really poor. As we started working with them, we recognized that their OCD had them counting all the E's on their page. They had to know how many E's were in each line per page. So by the time they got to the end of the story, they couldn't tell you the content of what that story is about, but they could tell you how many E's were on each and every page. And so it's really taking a look at, does the output match what we know that they can do? And if not, maybe there is potentially something else that's going on there. As I mentioned, can be quite debilitating. The anxiety can be very immobilizing and drowning. They might not want to share what some of their bad thoughts are. They might be too scared to voice them, or maybe they've gotten in trouble for voicing them. They might ask the same question repeatedly, looking for some of that reassurance. The problem is you can follow every single one of OCD's rules and they'll still want more. OCD's appetite is never satisfied. And so again, in the treatment of OCD, we learn very specific tools to start bossing back OCD, to stop following his rules on their terms and ways in which they can do it in manageable steps, which again, I'll talk a little bit more in the third webinar presentation. There can be a lot of avoidance of behavior if they know that, say, getting into the shower could lead to all kinds of rituals that may happen in the shower. They might just avoid getting in the shower altogether, or they may avoid starting their schoolwork if they know that OCD is going to hijack that and take over. So again, it looks very non-compliant, not following through on expectations, but it could be avoiding starting because they know the impact of what could potentially be happening, and they may not be able to voice that. They might appear very rigid, their anxiety might be high, their anger might be high, and again, a lot of that based on the anxiety and the fear that comes from having to follow the rules that OCD sets out. Okay, so again, possible struggles, that automatic no. You might ask them to do something and they might need a little bit more time to kind of figure out how much energy is that going to take. So they might automatically say no. They're buying themselves some time. And that kind of goes with some of the other leaky breaks as well. So kind of ignore that automatic no, because they might be able to follow through on their own. They might have very slow, tedious work output. Transitions are often very difficult. They might be very stuck on tasks. They might have to finish what they've started before they're permitted to move on to the next thing. So that can be very difficult. They might always be the last one in or late because OCD has engaged in rituals. There may be frequent long bathroom breaks, especially if they have that contamination flavor. They might be engaging in all kinds of washing and cleanliness. And again, high anxiety or that need for reassurance. So things that we do want to do is allow time for them to complete things, plan clear endpoints, and give them another task to help get them unstuck. So end one task with the start of another. And one thing that we learn in the treatment as well, and that I often coaching in schools and families in, is let's externalize the OCD. Let's give it a name. Let's call it what it is, because OCD often has us butting heads against each other. But when we can help them get, move past that and say, what's OCD say now? And some of our younger kids, well, Mr. Bossy Pants, Mr. Worry Pants, Organizer 3000, Codfish, they give them all kinds of creative names. It then puts us on the same page against OCD together. And then distraction can help them get unstuck. Try not to reason the stuckness away, because again, we mentioned OCD is irrational. And so that can just end up being frustrating for everybody. Focus on the object instead of the perseveration, and don't interpret their automatic no with opposition. They could just be very stuck in that moment. Which then leads to the next one, which is a similar leaky break, as in it's also leaky break over thoughts, but more that generalized anxiety disorder. When we think about anxiety, anxiety is very normal. It's adaptive, it's helped us function all these years. We don't actually want to eliminate all anxiety, because anxiety is what helps us prepare for things, to get ready, to study, to do all those things that are required. And a healthy level of anxiety will actually keep us safe. And we also know that anxiety is a part of life. We can't eliminate all things that could potentially cause us anxiety. But anxiety can become a problem. When we stop thinking about anxiety as just being uncomfortable, they can start to feel that anxiety is dangerous. I'm having a heart attack. This is never going to end. And so it can start to become a problem. It might be interfering in daily functioning. We might no longer be going to school or holding us back from a lot of different things. And that's when they would start to take a look at whether or not we are in anxiety disorder territory. So again, every single person experiences anxiety on some level, but anxiety can be a problem and disordered, which again meets a very specific criteria in the DSM-5. When we're feeling anxious, so whether it's OCD or the anxiety, our bodies are actually really coolly designed with this fight, flight, freeze response. And so when we think about when we're nice and calm, we are all operating from this prefrontal cortex part of our brain. If we were in actual danger and we're walking along the path and boom, there's a bear or something in front of us, What we want to happen is to move from this prefrontal cortex into the amygdala part of our brain. And that's where the fight, flight, freeze response is activated, because its only job is to keep you safe. So when that is activated, all kinds of things start to change in our bodies. Our pupils might start to dilate so we can hone in on the danger. Our heart starts to beat faster because its job is to get the blood pumping out to the major muscle groups in case we have to fight or run to keep ourselves safe, or even freeze can be a way in which we can keep ourselves safe. We may start to sweat because that's our body's internal cooling system. So there's all kinds of things that are happening. Our digestive system is shutting down because, again, it's our major muscle groups that are getting ready to fight or run if necessary. All of those things are amazing if there's actually a bear or something that's dangerous on the path in front of us. The problem is our bodies don't know the difference between a real threat and a perceived threat. So when we get an anxious thought or something that causes some fear, then it falsely triggers that fight, flight, freeze response, and we move into the amygdala part of our brain, even when there is no actual danger in front of us. And so a really important thing to think about when it comes to anxiety is this idea of the anxiety triad. So we get the anxious thought that pops into our head, and from our anxiety, from our thoughts, determine how we feel, our emotions, and our responses. Very often what we try to do is change how we're feeling and responding, but if we haven't stopped to think about what am I thinking about, and then actually change the thought, we're bound to repeat those same feelings and responses. So for example, if I'm walking down the street and I see a dog walking towards me with their owner, and I think, oh man, that dog's dangerous. I bet it's going to bite me. All dogs are dangerous. This is awful. I'm going to start to feel afraid and scared. And I'm probably going to respond by crossing the street or getting the heck out of there. Now imagine same scenario walking down the street, and this time I think, oh, what a cute little puppy. I just want to snuggle it. I hope they'll let me pet it. Now I'm going to be starting to feel a little bit happy, content. And my behavior is going to be very different. I'm probably going to approach the owner and ask if it's okay if I pet the dog. So the exact same thing was happening in both scenarios, but how I thought about this scenario drastically changed how I felt and how I responded. Okay, again, very similar to the leaky breakover thoughts with OCD, that automatic no, a lot of transition difficulties, a lot of avoidant refusal of tasks and expectations, especially if we have some of that social anxiety in a school setting. Could be really difficult to answer questions, put up our hand, do speeches, or even rating tests can be very difficult. And lots of frequent somatic complaints. These are the kids that are complaining of headaches, stomach aches, not feeling well, again, because their bodies could be responding that way when we think about that amygdala part of our brain and everything gets activated. And if they're not recognizing it's anxiety, then they might actually become more anxious that maybe I am sick, or they are just feeling overwhelmed and anxious and using that feeling sick as a way to be able to avoid that going to that place or facing that event. So again, very similar, allow time to complete tasks, front-loading upcoming expectations, allowing more time to complete when possible. Also, like the OCD, externalizing some of those sticky thoughts, and distraction can be a really helpful one. We think about relaxation strategies, grounding techniques, a lot of those can help get unstuck when we're in that kind of vicious loop of anxiety. Again, in that third webinar, I'll also be talking about the treatment of anxiety, which is the cognitive behavior therapy. And things not to do is try not to reason the stuckness or worried thought away. Again, may not be logical, but that feeling that they have is very real. Don't interpret automatic no with opposition. And we also don't want to drop the expectation. We often talk about we're not lowering the bar for these youth, we're just helping them get over it in a different way by giving them a different set of tools to be able to help. So maybe there's a changing of the expectations initially, but what we really want them to be able to see is that they can manage through some of these emotions. Because what anxiety does is three things really well. It has us overestimate the likelihood of something bad happening, overestimate how bad it would be if that thing did happen, and underestimate our ability to cope. So we want to be able to show them that you can actually cope. Even if that worst thing happened, probably not going to be the end of the world. There are going to be some things that we can do, even if it's difficult, to be able to cope. Okay, I'm going to go through one more leaky break, and I'm going to leave the last one for our next webinar, as it goes really well with some of the strategies that we'll be talking about. So the last one that I just want to go through quickly here is leaky break over our sensory input. So it may have been described as different things. You might hear different diagnoses. Maybe it's a sensory integration disorder, sensory hypersensitivity, sensory processing dysfunctions like sensory hypersensitivity, sensory defensiveness. Really, all this means is we are struggling with the input that we are receiving into our body. When we think about our sensory, we're all on this spectrum. And most of us know, our five senses. We've got the sight, sound, taste, smell, touch. We also have two other pieces of our sensory kind of profile, which is our proprioceptive input. So kind of our muscle input, knowing where we are in space and registering that, and our vestibular system, which is balance. So all of those things are part of our sensory profile, and we may be hyper or hypo depending. So if we are hypersensitive to some of these things, it might mean that lights are really, really bright, too bright, even lights that feel manageable to other people, or sounds are just really too loud. We've even had kids say, like, the lights are too loud, like I can hear them just buzzing all the time. And so we might have some of that hypersensitivity, or maybe I'm really hypersensitive to touch. If somebody even touches me lightly, it's, oh, don't do that. It can be quite distressing. Or on the flip side, it can be the hyposensitivity. So maybe I need every light on in the house in order to register that, or I'm listening to things at really top volume, really, really loud, and I've got multiple things kind of going on that's inputting that, or I'm that rammy kid that's banging into things and sitting down really hard and often walking into people because I'm not kind of aware of where I am in space. Often when we are not getting the appropriate amount of sensory input, it can lead to increased anxiety, shutting down, yelling, hitting, crying, and it becomes very difficult for youth to filter out things that we may not even notice. For example, that light that I was sharing about. Oh, I've already described the low. And so they talk about this sensory processing dysfunction as being as inconsistent as leaky brakes on a car. So it can be very unpredictable, inconsistent, and can come and go. So maybe one day we can handle all of this sensory input, and on another day, it's incredibly overwhelming. So really, it's about control. Having predictable stimulation is much better tolerated. So for example, those that struggle with being touched, if we have to put our hands on them, say, I'm going to put my hand on you now, making it become predictable, making them become aware of it before it actually happens. And then being able to front load them if we're going into places that might be really loud or could potentially be overstimulating, but also remembering, like if we think of the fair, all of us are gonna be like, oh my gosh, that's sensory overload. And so we would be very easily able to front load them that you're gonna be in an environment that has lots of stimulation going on, but also keeping in mind certain areas that we may not find overly stimulating may be overstimulating for them and can cause some of that dysregulation. And again, those are the different types of our senses that are impacted. So sight, visual, sound, taste, smell, touch, vestibular, which is balance, and that proprioceptive input, understanding where we are in space. Okay, and so again, it can be difficult. It can look very attention-seeking. Again, when it's so inconsistent, it can look very behavioral. You were fine yesterday. Why is this a problem today? Or that fight or flight instinct can kick in. So you might find somebody that gets very overwhelmed. And then let's just say sound is a really difficult one. And there's a lot of sound going on and they're becoming overwhelmed. Well, now they start screaming and becoming the loudest person in the room. And you think, well, what is that about? If you don't like sound, why are you the one that's screaming the loudest? And it's because for them, they're able to control that sound. So it's attempting to get some of the control back over that sensory input, so they become the loudest one. for that very reason, or they may leave an area or take off because they've become so overwhelmed by some of that sensory input. And the hyposensitive, so these might be kids, again, kind of like that bull in the china shop. So they might have really that kind of rough and tough collision-filled play. They might not know their own strength. They might engage in some of that risk-taking behavior. So they're jumping from the playground. They're the rough and tumble kids, as I said, like banging into other people or things. Again, can look behavioral, but it could just be because they're attempting to get the input that they need into their sensory system in order to feel kind of at baseline and regulated. So again, possible struggles, it could be a large part of that reactivity to noise, light, temperature, touch. They may be very distracted by their clothing, so seams in the socks, tags in their clothes, certain material like jeans or buttons or certain things can be very distressing. If you think about if you put on your socks and you feel that seam in your sock when you first put it on, probably pretty quickly that goes to the background and we're not thinking about it anymore. It can be something that they are hyper-focused on that entire time where it feels incredibly uncomfortable. There could be a lot of picky eating. Maybe it's the texture of the food, the temperature of the food, the spices in the food. They might say it's not spicy enough or it's way too spicy. And all we put on it is a little bit of pepper or not too much. And so it can look like that picky eating, the sensation seeker, again, those rough and tumble kids that are seeking that input into their sensory system, or they can become very easily nauseous if they are having struggles with their vestibular system. So these might be the kids that get car sick really easily, or any kind of motion on the swings or certain things could cause nausea, whereas other kids want to spin, 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 spin to get more input. It can go the opposite, where even just a slight motion can cause that nausea. So again, avoid touching without front loading them first, less stimulation where possible. Sensory items or diet, so things like weighted backpacks, weighted, you can get weighted lizards or frogs that they can put on their lap, having sensory items that they can place in their hands, weighted blankets, sound dampening headphones, things that can be really helpful for them in that kind of sensory diet, or heavy work, moving heavy books from place to place, or raking or vacuuming to get some of that input into their proprioceptive system there. And again, when possible, front loading any type of upcoming stimulation that may be happening. Avoid that, try to get used to it or get over a technique. You'll be fine, just get used to it. It's noisy, you'll be fine. Try not to add to the stimulation where possible. And again, not jumping to conclusions. If they have their sunglasses on, it could be because they're really light sensitive, or so there's some different things that could be going on at that time. Okay, I think I'm going to stop it there because the next webinar we're going to be focusing on some of those behavior strategies and what happens when we're having a more difficult time regulating some of our emotions and behavior, and some strategies that could potentially be helpful for that. So I think this might be a good place to stop that at.